You're watching Beyond Markets. Welcome. I'm Esther Awoniyi. Many thanks for joining us today. On today's show, we'll be looking at the state of education in South Africa. As always, you can join today's conversation with the hashtag Beyond Markets. You can also send your thoughts and your comments to my Twitter handle too. It's at Esther Awoniyi. Now, a recent report by the South African Institute of Race Relations is beaming the spotlight on the state of education in the Rainbow Nation. The IRR notes that despite recent successes recorded in the 2019 matric pass rate, the failures and deficiencies in the schooling system, if left unaddressed, could stunt the life chances of many young people. Hermann Pretorius, campaign coordinator at the South African Institute of Race Relations, joins me now for today's discussion. Hermann, thank you for taking the time out to join us. Now, the Institute of Race Relations' recent report on the state of education in South Africa submits that education is the single greatest obstacle to socio-economic advancement in South Africa. The report also goes on to highlight some positives and some negatives, but I see that there's a spotlight on the part where, on the challenges in the education system. But I'd like you to just walk us through this report, starting with your findings and perhaps also starting with those positives that you highlighted in the report.
Well, you see, it's definitely something to be celebrated when young people achieve better matric results than ever before. And as a South African, and indeed, I think as a continent, we should be very encouraged that young people are achieving under incredibly difficult circumstances. So firstly, credit where credit is due. These young people work hard, and it's really encouraging to see, and the pass rate here in South Africa being at the highest point it's ever been is also, I think, part of that celebration, and rightly so. What the Institute of Race Relations, however, want to highlight in this report and a subsequent report that we published is that if you want to understand what's going to happen to the class of 2020, the grade ones who, with their first school bags and those new school shoes, when they show up for the first day, what's going to happen to them? What are the educational policies that they will be facing? What are the fears, the risks, the hopes that they can bank on? And what we did in this report is very much to try and understand from an ideological point of view what the ANC, the governing party here in South Africa, might see as the future of education. Now, the ANC is the national government, but it also governs 8 of the 9 provinces here. So at a national and at a provincial level, what it thinks should happen in education is absolutely crucial. And from our research, and from almost 9 decades of doing research and understanding the ideology of the ANC, we have identified that within the Gauteng province, the province where the cities of Johannesburg and Pretoria are situated, very densely populated and economically important province for South Africa, there the ANC, after the 2019 election, just held on to power. But the approach taken in this province by the ANC, and specifically by the ANC's Department of Education here provincially, by MEC Panyaza Lesufi, the Provincial Executive Council member for education, his approach is very much in tune with the ideological approach of the ANC broadly. So if you want to see the successes or the failures, the risks and hopes that the class of 2020 might be facing during their next 12 years of education, the ANC's policy in Gauteng with regards to education is definitely the place to look. And there are some successes. The Gauteng has done well in this last generation of pass rates coming at the end of last year. But there are also significant risks, a creeping involvement of the state, where the Institute of Race Relations, where we think that parents should have more powers and more freedom to choose.
Now, looking at some of the numbers, especially in the part of the report where it highlights some of the negatives and some of the things that really do concern the Institute of Race Relations, I'm just wondering, what is there a broad appreciation, especially on the part of the regulators and the government, in terms of how dire this situation is? Do they appreciate? Is there an understanding that this is a big problem. And I remember sometime in July last year, the Basic Education Minister did announce a number of changes in the South African school system, including increased focus on early education development and also the introduction of new subjects. I'm just wondering, how did that play out? Were there changes made? And of course, my first question, which is there a broad understanding and appreciation of the problem in the education system right now?
Yes, I think there is. Credit where credit is due to the governments nationally and provincially. There is this recognition that education can't go on as it has, because as we highlight in the report, the matric pass rate is essentially just a snapshot of a 12-year period. And if you want to understand the failures and the successes of education in South Africa, you have to look at the whole 12-year period. For example, if you take the class of 2005 that started grade 1 in 2005 and ended their matric careers in 2017, you start with a group of 1.2 million grade 1s excited on that first day of school. And then you track their performance throughout 12 years. Now, the most worrying statistic that we unearthed, and I think it's broadly acknowledged, I've been in discussions with other people within the sector, from NGOs involved in education, all of these actors acknowledge that this statistic that I'm about to give you is a big problem. From that 1.2 million grade 1s in 2005, in 2017, the number of that 1.2 million original group that passed matric mathematics with 50% or more was merely 55,000. So you've gone from 1.2 million grade 1s to only 55,000 matriculants passing matric mathematics with more than 50%. In 2018, that number fell by a further 5,000, so it's now down to 50,000. That is an incredibly worrying red flag that should be waving, especially in a country like South Africa, where between 22 and 25% of future unemployment will depend on the financial sector, where mathematical skills and numeracy levels are crucial to ensuring a stable economy and stable employment for these kids graduating schools.
If I could just come in here, Hermann, where the mathematics is concerned, what would you say is a problem? Is it the quality of the teachers? Is it the quality of the teachers? Is it the students? Based on your research, what would you say is at the heart of that particular problem?
I think it's definitely the quality of the education, not necessarily the quality of the teachers. We are very proud to have very good teachers here in South Africa, but not all teachers really live up to that standard. And I think the underlying problem and the ideological problem we identify with the ANC's approach to education is the state, the government, gaining more and more powers with regards to education. So you've got a problem here. In South Africa, if your child is not doing well in mathematics and is possibly one of the problem cases that won't be included in that 55 or 50,000 passing matric maths with 50% plus, then you as a parent have you have a very difficult route to accountability. We have, for example, in South Africa here, the South African Democratic Teachers Union, and a report by the Department of Basic Education in 2016 highlighted that 6 of the 9 provinces are very much indebted to this teachers' union, and I think some journalists and commentators have used the word captured. Now in South Africa, that's a very loaded term, but you've got a problem here where teaching standards cannot be directly addressed by parent involvement. The power of parents and the power of school governing bodies are unfortunately being lessened, and there's educational legislation coming down the pipeline that'll take that even further. So what is the problem, you ask? The problem is that schools are insured of funding, whether they perform well or not, and teachers, in most cases, are insured of jobs, whether they perform or not. The system has destroyed some very crucial incentives, and the IRR submits that parents should receive more powers again to hold teachers accountable, because let's be honest, who knows what's best for a child? A politician in some capital city somewhere, or a parent. And the Institute of Race Relations really believes that if we can give parents the power to hold schools accountable, to hold teachers accountable, and remove the role or lessen the role to a cooperative one of teachers' unions in this country, the children of South Africa can really live up to their very, very promising potential.
Hermann, you mentioned funding. And I know that every year, of course, at the national budget level, there's allocations to the education sector. Has there been a decline, or has there been an increase? What's the status right now?
There has been an increase. In 2016-17, about 5 years ago, we were looking at somewhere between 140 billion and 160 billion rand on average. But in 2018-19, that went up to 250 billion. Now, so the South African government spends around 20.4% of its budget on education. So the problem isn't funding. The problem really has been making sure that South Africans get, as it were, bang for their buck, to make sure that funding goes where it is necessary and where it can be effectively used. And one of the policy suggestions and solutions that the Institute of Race Relations proposes is a school voucher system, where the government can take these billions and billions of rands, and instead of spending them on behalf of parents, parents can then get a voucher equivalent of between 12 and 15,000 rand that is attached to their child, so that wherever that child goes to school, the parent can spend those school vouchers in that school where they think their child might have the best chance. So instead of the government, as in Gauteng is happening currently, instead of the government placing kids saying, you go to school A, you go to school B, you go to school C, parents can have the liberty to use the resources made available by state funding to say, right, I can decide with these resources that the state has made available for me where my child can go to school. And that will ensure that schools can no longer bank on the state funding if they don't perform, and teachers can no longer bank on employment if they don't perform. It gives parents the ability to hold schools accountable, while at the same time making sure that precious resources are available to parents from very disadvantaged backgrounds, predominantly black backgrounds in South Africa. It would be a way to make sure that that problem that I mentioned in my earlier answer, that issue of accountability, can really be addressed in rands and cents value, and we could see the results coming from that. And in fact, if you look at research the IRR has done in 2018, published in May that year, township schools, if you compare low-fee paying township schools that are run essentially by private institutions where parents have great say of accountability, and you compare those schools to township schools run by the state, the difference is incredible. It's not that South African kids are stupid. It's not that township kids are stupid. It's that kids are failing because politicians are failing. And if we can give parents the financial support they need and the accountability mechanisms they desire, then we can see these numbers rise dramatically.
Yes, if you're just joining us, Hermann Pretorius, campaign coordinator at the South African Institute of Race Relations, is our guest today on the show, and we've been exploring ways to drive, and we've been, of course, taking a deeper look into the South African education system. Hermann, thank you for your time so far. I'll just taking a second look at the report, and something that also catches my attention is the disparities, the differences between the quality or perhaps the participation in the education system, for example, in the tertiary, at the tertiary level between whites, blacks and Indians. And it would look like for the blacks, they are lagging at this moment. Could you just elaborate further and just shed more light on that for us?
Of course. Firstly, I think the government since 1994 should get some credit here. When the apartheid came to an end and the ANC took over in the mid-90s, there was an even greater discrepancy between the number of, for example, black engineering students and white engineering students. That imbalance has been very much addressed. It still has some ways to go, but we in South Africa now have more black engineering graduates than whites, and that is a very important step in ensuring that, you know, these cruel and inhumane inequalities left over from the apartheid regime can truly be addressed. But the problem is still, where we see failures in education, it really is the poor black South Africans who are losing in this whole trade-off. So the question then becomes, there is this discrepancy. White South Africans are achieving at similar rates that they were achieving 20, 30 years ago, and the improvement for black students that improvement has not been sufficient, and a question becomes why? And if you then look again at the study I mentioned earlier, this isn't a race problem. It's not that white students are just smarter or black students are just less educatable. It really isn't that. It is a matter of standards, of education standards. And if you're going to look at where the white middle class traditionally goes to school, those schools are very well funded and achieve reasonably consistent good results. Compare that to the areas where poorer black kids go to school, and you see something very different. So the question then becomes, how can you achieve this equality? And the government in Gauteng specifically has approached this problem very much with a school zoning and a school placement system approach, where the state and the government decides where your kid can go to school. Now, the problem with these strict zoning applications is you essentially reduce the success statistically of a child in the South African education system to a postcode lottery. Where they are born, they will go to school. Where they go to school, that will be an indication whether they succeed or fail. And that just isn't good enough. And I've personally, in these last few weeks, spoken to parents who have struggled getting their children placed in schools in KwaZulu-Natal and here in Soweto, very close to Johannesburg, where we are now. So you really get the sense that parents are incredibly frustrated because they know that the education their kid receives or their children receives, that will be crucial to determining their success going forward. And at the same time, we have this awareness that this vast inequality must be addressed and equality must be achieved. And then the simple question becomes, how can we do that? Now, the government in Gauteng has put in a very, very strict placement system, an online placement system, and the deadline for placing students, that whole process was at the end of October last year. By the end of October 2019, almost 35,000 kids in Gauteng for grade 1 and grade 8 were not yet placed. Now, that's a failure from the government side. They had to extend that deadline to the end of November, and then even at the start of the academic year in 2020, this year, there were still thousands and thousands of kids unplaced. Now, that's a problem. If the government is going to intervene, saying they will decide, not parents, the government will decide where they send kids to school, then the least they can do is live up to that promise of actually placing kids in schools. As long as that isn't happening, we must ask the question whether politicians or parents are really the right people to make these decisions. And the institute for which I work really advocates in favor of parents making that decision, putting the money, the resources at their disposal in the form of school vouchers, and ensuring that equality can be achieved by parents making the decisions they see best for their children.
Now, Hermann, is the government against that option, having parents determine, those schools that their children rather attend? Obviously, the government hasn't done a fantastic job at solving the problem. And now, for the Institute of Race Relations, as a policy, perhaps a broad policy response, is this something that you've strongly recommended to the government? If so, what's been the response so far?
We have recommended this very, very strongly, and response has really varied. But the problem is the discussion between a think tank like the Institute of Race Relations and governments and politicians can be very productive. But the real indicator of what the government is planning to do is policy. There can be very productive discussions, there can be a lot of research, but as long as the government doesn't change policy, we can be sure that the problems of the current status quo will remain. And in Gauteng, which we identify as a bellwether for education policy, more broadly speaking in the country, in Gauteng we see the opposite movement, not more choice to parents, not more powers to school governing bodies acting as representatives of parental interests. We see the opposite. We see government taking a stronger and a firmer involvement in the placement of students, and we see the lessening of school governing bodies and their powers and their influence. So it's a very, very worrying tangent or direction that we are on, and we at the IRR are really, really pushing for this to be altered. And we've spoken to parents from all walks of life, and this really is a universal feeling. Parents know that if someone should be responsible for education, it should be them, and they want the freedom, they want the resources to do that. The government should be very, very wary in denying them that freedom.
Well, has there been a direct pressure from the parents themselves, perhaps through a unified body representing the parents and putting pressure on the government? Is that happening right now?
What we have seen in these last few weeks are individual cases where parents from a specific school or from a collection of schools really do start banding together, going to the education department headquarters in Gauteng and, really asking for these kind of resources and freedoms that we are trying to secure them. But I think it's part of a broader campaign that we need to fight. Parents need to understand how much power they really do have over education. And I don't think parents have up to now been fully aware or fully cognizant of the amount of leverage that they can truly bring to this fight. And that's why the Institute of Race Relations published this first report saying what the problems are, but a week later also published a second report exclusively based on solutions, so that we can tell parents, you know what, you can tell politicians where they should get off the school bus. You can take control of that. And we really try to get parents to join institutions like the one I work for, the IRR, or of the other NGO civilian organizations that advocate for better education standards. So as yet, we haven't seen big parental groups move in any specific direction, but we have seen shifts in this debate, and it's very encouraging to see.
Hermann, I must thank you for your time today. Thank you so much for talking to us on Beyond Markets. And of course, I wish you all the best and hope that this challenge can be solved as quickly as possible. Thank you for talking to us today. Hermann Pretorius, campaign coordinator at the South African Institute of Race Relations, of course, giving us a deeper look into some of the challenges within the South African education system. That's our show for today. Thank you so much for being a part of it. Remember, you can watch the show at 5 p.m. West African time daily and have access to all previous episodes of the show on our website, that's cnbcafrica.com. You can also stay engaged with the hashtag Beyond Markets. And of course, you can send your thoughts and your comments to my Twitter handle too. It's at Esther or Awoniyi. For myself and the team, it's bye for now.